Assalamu alaikum class. Today we're going to start our lecture number 7 for research methodology. The topic of discussion today is the research design. Previously what we did was we talked about how to create hypothesis statements. We looked at the different types of hypothesis statements, where we looked at directional and non-directional hypothesis statements. We looked at the null and alternate hypothesis statements. And then we also briefly talked about the statistical notations used in hypothesis statements. Today we're going to talk about the research design, because based on the hypothesis statements, now we are ready to actually move on to the next phase of the research process, whereby we need to plan as to how we're going to go about conducting the research. That is, we're going to plan about our research activities. We have identified the problem, we had looked at the different literature, and we have developed our theoretical framework, and we have developed our hypothesis statements, which are basically our theories which we have so far developed. Now, to test these theories, to test these hypothesis statements, we need to basically actually go ahead and collect data. But how do we go about collecting data? What will be the method of it? Who will be the respondents? Who are the how we're going to do the analysis? What kind of tools we'll be using? These kind of things we will be talking about in the research design. That is, in the research design, basically we will be concentrating on the planning effect, the planning side of research methodology process. So we're going to plan about as to how we're going to prove our hypothesis. What are the methods? What are the techniques? What kind of data we're going to use? What kind of samples we're going to use? So we need to sit down and considering the hypothesis we have, the problem we want to sort out, based on what is the problem, the issue, we will plan as to how we're going to go about conducting research. So once we are able to develop a plan, then the next thing is we will be able basically will try to execute that plan. So like any other project, when we look up, we tend to first of all plan the activities of that project, and then we move on and actually execute the project. Similarly, when we conduct a research, it's like a project, and in that project we need to, before we start the project, we need to plan and think of the possible avenues, roads, opportunities we have to conduct the research. So let's start with the actual session now. As I said, the elements of research design refers to the outline, plan, or the strategy specifying the procedure to be used to answer the research question. So we are basically planning the procedures we're going to use to conduct the research. And there are different issues we will be talking about. Of course, all these issues will be in the context of the research and how related to the research process. And we need to make different choices, like in any planning stage. We need to think of how we're going to go about conducting the plan, how we're going to go about conducting the research. But while we're conducting research, we will have different choices to make from, and based on the kind of problem we have, based on the kind of hypothesis we have established so far, we will basically try to plan our research activities accordingly. Some of the activities we'll need to, or the issues we need to discuss about in our plan, our research design, is that we need to decide what is the type of investigation we will be going to conduct. What will be the study settings? What will be the extent of researchers' interference? What kind of unit analysis will be made in this research? What will be the time horizon of the study? and if this study is going to be a causal or correlation study. So these are some of the issues. Some of the issues we need to talk about, such as the type of investigation the study is going to be, the study setting, the researcher's interference, the unit of analysis, time horizon, and so forth. We need to think and discuss about it and make a choice as to what type of investigation we're going to follow, the study setting which we're going to take, the researcher interference in that scenario, how much is that going to be, what will be the unit of analysis of our data, what will be the time horizon for the study, and if it's going to be causal or a correlation type of a study. All these issues need to be addressed, and certain directions will be taken based on the decision we make. Okay, if you look at this diagram, I think this is slightly coming not as nicely as I would like to see. It's slightly more bluish here. But what we have done here, there are research design activities, or one by one. There are different activities which have been listed, and the choices you might have are listed right down there. So these are considered to be the different activities, the research design activities on which we need to discuss about, such as here we are looking at that the unit of analysis could be individual, dyad, or organizational. Now, based on the different unit of analysis, based on the study, we need to think and decide upon what the unit of analysis would be for our research. And similarly, if the research is going to be a one-shot cross-sectional study or longitudinal study. So these are some of the different research design issues. Some of them we will be going to cover in this session and the next session, and some of them will be covered later in the course, such as the sampling, data sampling is one of the issue also, which is again a part of the research design we need to think of and think as how we're going to collect the sample, what will be the sample, and so forth. So there are some other activities as well, but first we're going to concentrate on some of these activities in these next two sessions. And let's start with the first issue we need to discuss and talk about is the purpose of the study. Okay, what we mean by the purpose of study is that we want to decide as to if our research is going to be of exploratory nature or descriptive nature, or it's going to be hypothesis testing. That is, the purpose of study is to basically explore an area of research, is to describe an area of research, or to test a hypothesis test an area of research. All these three have a different flavor and it requires a different sort of focus and energy and resources, and all these three types will also determine the stage at which the research is in that area. What I mean by that is, if an area of research is something where is very little research has been conducted, very little is known, no clear theories have yet been established, the concepts have not yet been crystallized, the issue has not been properly formulated yet. In that case, we were going to focus and we will say that this kind of research is what we call as an exploratory side of type of a research, where we're trying to explore an area where very little prior research has been conducted. So it indicates that the research and the area of that research is still new. So if the area of the research is a bit new, or that area where little research has been conducted, we will basically say that it is an exploratory type of research. On the other hand, if the area has the issue has been properly explained or has been properly defined, but we would like to know a little more about that area, such as we would like to know the certain characteristics of that issue, certain traits of that particular issue. That is when we will say that we are going to conduct what we call as a descriptive research study. Once we have the characteristics properly formulated of our particular issue, the next thing we do is we try to do what we call as a hypothesis testing kind of a study, where we try to project, try to infer certain things. We try to basically hypothesize certain scenarios, because at this stage we are clear about the issue, we are clear about the certain characteristics of that issue. We are basically trying to infer or basically try to give in terms of predict in terms of the future, that how that's going to happen. That is, we try to theorize the issue. So all these three themes have slightly different intensity at the level of knowledge, and we need to decide as to what our research design is going to be in terms of the purpose. So we need to decide if the purpose of research is exploratory, descriptive, or testing hypothesis. And so we said the nature of the study, whether it's exploratory, descriptive, hypothesis, depends on the stage of the knowledge we are at. Basically, if the area has been properly already researched, naturally, then we will move to what we call as an hypothesis testing sort of a scenario. So the purpose will be in that stage will be hypothesis testing. Whereas if it's very new, then we'll say it's an exploratory. So then the purpose of the study then will be exploratory. There are again, in some cases, when we've tried to focus our research for a specific organization and try to solve a problem of a specific organization, then the purpose of the study is what we call as a case study. This is generally when we are trying to conduct research for a specific organization and for a specific problem, then that the purpose of that study is a case study, which basically examines the organizational situation and tries to solve the problem. For understanding the phenomena, and again basically what we try to see is what is within the organization, what is the problem, what is the phenomena happening, and we try to theorize based on what is available within that organization. So if the study is focused for an organization and it is focused for just one particular type of problem, that's when we say it's what we call as a case study. So the purpose, now we say there are basically three types of purposes we have identified. We said the purpose is exploratory, descriptive, or hypothesis testing, and the fourth one we talked about is the case study. Let's go and look at some of the examples on how could an exploratory study be conducted. We said that exploratory studies are undertaken for better comprehension of the problem. We want to understand, we need to comprehend the problem itself. So if we don't understand the problem properly, then that's when we need to conduct what we call as an exploratory study. As because very few studies have been conducted in that area, very little is known about that issue, so we don't understand the issue properly. So Once that's the case, then then the study is called an exploratory study. The method of conducting the study, the tool we use for conducting the study is usually based on interviews, because that's when you can get to know insight about the issue by an expert in that area. Usually when there is a new area emerges, you won't find so many people who can talk about it or who can explain that. You need to go to the best, and the people who are right at the cutting edge, or the people who are the expert of that area, need to go and talk to them, interview in an interview, and try to understand the issue, because very little at that stage has been written on it, and very little has been known about that area. So the way you go about in that in the exploratory studies is you take interviews to better understand the phenomena, because you need first-hand interaction with these people, the experts who can explain, because at this stage again the problem has not been crystallized, and once as I said that at this stage very little research has been done on that. So one need to first of all establish the issue itself. As we generally in other kind of research where we are trying to look at the quantitative data, here more on the qualitative data is usually accessed. Basically we try to see and try to explain that what is the issue, what is the phenomena occurring, by discussing with the experts. Let's look at an example. Way back in 1970, when Mittensberg wanted to conduct research, and he wanted to know that what are the different nature of managerial work which is being carried out by different managers in the U.S. In the U.S. firms. So at that stage in 1970s, since very few managers were there, and the job of the nature of the work of the managers was not very defined, Mittensberg, in his PhD thesis, what he did was he went about and conducted different interviews with managers to establish what is their nature of job. As we know now, we know what the nature of job of a manager is, but back in the 70s, when the title of a manager or the jobs of a manager were very rare and very few people knew what is the exact nature of work they are supposed to do. So at that stage, when Mittensberg wanted to define what is the nature of the managerial work, then at that stage, that kind of study would have been considered as an exploratory study, where again he did interviews to formulate certain theories about managerial roles and the type of activities that which are done. So of course at this stage we are very clear if you can know what are the different roles of a manager are, but way back in 70s, early 70s, the exact nature of job was not known. So a study conducted at that stage, way back, on the role of a manager or the nature of work of a manager, those kind of studies would be considered as exploratory studies. Another example could be on more recent times is the concept of virtual markets. Of course, in 2005, when the internet became the common household word, a lot of businesses wanted to explore the commerce side of the internet, and at that stage, to know or to define what is a virtual market is, again at that stage the experts of the internet were the ones who could elaborate that what is the concept of virtual markets are. That is the marketplace where people could come and buy and sell their products in the virtual world. So in 2005, when initially the commerce side of the internet was explored, defining what is a virtual market was very new, very unique. So experts who were experts on the internet or the e-business side or e-commerce side of the issue, those were people who knew what a virtual market is. So if a study was conducted to define what is a virtual market, would be considered at that stage, would be considered as a exploratory study. The next purpose of the study is said once we are is what we call as the descriptive studies. The purpose of the study could be descriptive. A descriptive study is undertaken in order to ascertain and to be able to describe the characteristics of the variables. So the focus here is we want to describe the characteristics of the variable of interest, such as we're saying in basically if we say that if we know the phenomena, we understand the phenomena such as the phenomena of nature of managerial work, we understand what is a manager, what is the nature of the manager. And now the next thing we want to do is describe the characteristics of the variable as to, let's say if we want to know how many firms have managers, and if the managers are there, what kind of education or the level of education they have. We wanted to know as to what type of organization have these kind of managers. So here we're trying to describe the characteristics of the managers, where previously we were trying to identify the nature of the work of the managers. So the difference here is we're trying to define the characteristics of the particular issue of the situation, and usually we tend to try to get figures such as we try to get the percentages, we try to get the number of people in an area, the number of incidences in that case, and basically it's trying to describe the characteristics of a particular phenomena. So for instance, if we would like to study a class in terms of the percentage of members who are senior, who are junior, what is the gender composition, the age grouping, this number of semesters they are in, the number of business courses they have taken. So we're not confused about the issue of a student. Or a class. We know what is a class is. Or we know what a student is. We are trying to define that in this particular university, how many are male, how many students are male, how many are female, how many are in the first year, how many in the second year, how many are in the third year, and so forth. In the case of a manager, the types of managers, we would like to know how many managers are working at the middle level, and at the higher level, at the lower level, how many managers are male, how many managers are female. So here we're trying to describe the characteristics, just like we can say that we are defining that what is a keyboard is, which I have it right in front of me. What is a keyboard is, especially a computer keyboard, because there are other kinds of keyboards as well. So once we are able to define what a keyboard is and what the function of a keyboard is, we would like to know that in a shop, how many keyboards are there. So when we're trying to define how many keyboards are there in the shop, or in a university, or in an office, that's where we're looking at the descriptive side of the issue. The purpose of that study is descriptive in nature. how many keyboards, how many are working, how many are not working, how many are of black color, how many are white color, so forth. So in the previous, if we are trying to say what is a keyboard is, what is the function of a keyboard is, that's we would say is an exploratory kind of a research, and when we say no, we are trying to define that how many keyboards are there in an office, and how many are working, how many are not, how many are white, how many are blacks, and so forth, will be of a descriptive kind of a research. Okay, so we're saying basically descriptive studies present data in a meaningful form to help us understand the characteristic of a group in a given situation. Basically, it helps us think systematically about the aspect in a given situation, offer ideas for future probing of research, and help us make certain simple decisions such as how many and what type of individuals should be transferred from a department to another, or in the case of the keyboard, how many are broken, how many are working, so that a simple decision as to how many keyboards should be basically we should order. By descriptively knowing that how many keyboards are there and how many are working, how many are not working. So a descriptive kind of study helps us make simpler business decisions as to how many to order. Similarly, in an organization, if we find out that how many are male workers, how many female workers, how many are working in the night shift, how many working the day shift, how many are locals, how many are from the suburbs. This kind of information helps us make certain decisions as who to transfer, who to promote, who to support, and that sort of a thing. So descriptively, once we describe the describe the certain phenomena, then we are able to make certain business decisions. Another example for a descriptive study is that a bank manager wants to have a profile of the individuals who have loan payments outstanding for 6 months and more. Now, a manager would like to know that how many people have loans, have taken loans, and they have the payment is due and it's 6 months over that the payments has been due. So if the payments are due, he's trying to look at how many people have loan payments who are outstanding payments due. So what a manager, when he tries to find out that how many are there, and the second thing is he would include details such as what is their average age, how many they are, what is their average age, what is their earning, what is the type of occupation. Now, getting this kind of information, what we call as a descriptive information of the loan takers, will help him make decisions as to give loans to people who are give not loan to those people who are the type of people who delay their payments beyond 6 months. How does he know that? By studying the existing data, what he is able to find out that these people who have loans older than 6 months, he tries to find out what are the characteristics. What are the characteristics is maybe such as what is the nature of job they are doing, what is the age group they are, how much is the usually earnings are. So by looking at this kind of data, which is trying to characterize the loan takers, it will help him make business decisions such as who to give to loan and who not to give to loan. Okay, so this example again illustrates that sometimes, although we know what a loan is and who's a loan taker, but the types of people who have taken loan and they are late in their payments beyond 6 months, a descriptive study on what is their nature of job, how much do they earn, what is the age group, and so forth, will help describe the loan takers in more detail. But this will also help them make decisions, which is useful for the businesses. Another example, let's look at it. The Ministry of Science and Technology wants to know how many projects have failed. Now, we know back in the very early times when the projects, of course, the definition of project was already defined. What is a project? Generally, there is no confusion about the term project at all. The next stage is we wanted to know is how many projects have failed or succeeded by a specific organization such as the Ministry of Science and Technology. Now, Ministry of Science and Technology might like to know how many projects have failed, what were the reasons out of the triple constraint, cost, time, and scope, how many failed due to the scope constraint. Now, getting this kind of information, that how many failed and how many failed due to the scope constraint, might help the management, the ministry, to tighten up the scope definition, so that this failure, the cause of the failure, could be reduced. So by basically getting simple descriptive information on how many projects were issued, were authorized, how many succeeded, how many failed, and among the failure, how many failed due to time constraint, how many failed due to the cost constraint, how many failed due to the scope constraint, they could focus down to as to how many failed because of the scope, and then they could revise their proposals, research proposal format, in which they could emphasize on defining the scope in a more detailed manner, so that they could avoid failures due to the scope definition and so forth. So small studies in where the management would like to know some characteristics, and based on the characteristics of the issue they would like to make decisions. Is the purpose is the type of studies for which the purpose is descriptive in nature. The third type, which we talked about as far as the purpose of the research was concerned, is considered to be the hypothesis testing. In the hypothesis testing is basically undertaken to explain the variance in the dependent variable or to predict organizational outcomes. Usually all the hypotheses we looked at in the previous session, if you remember, were all basically trying to predict or theorize certain things, such as the motivation level of men is more than women. This is again, we're trying to predict, we're trying to theorize something. Similarly, we're saying the more training an individual gets, the higher the performance of the organization will become. Again, we're trying to predict, we're trying to explain the variability in the dependent variable because of an independent variable. So if your research has reached to a level that we can theorize, such as just the previous example looking at, if we have been able to theorize that projects whose scopes have been properly defined tend to become more successful. Now this is your the next level of your purpose, whereby initially what you did was, let's say you said define what is a project is, and way back in let's say way back in 60s, one could say, okay, let's define the term project. And way back in, let's say 90s or 80s, one would say, okay, let's find out what are the causes of the failure of the projects, and while identifying different failure, the reason of the failure, what the next stage of research would be to say that you could say that the projects which scopes were not properly defined, those projects failed. So you're saying the scope is basically is an independent variable, and the project success is dependent on it, and you're trying to predict that if the project scope is not properly defined, projects will fail. Now this kind of statement is now a statement, or the purpose of the research would be hypothesis testing. So starting with exploratory, where what project says, moving down to how many projects were conducted in the last, let's say, 10 years, how many succeeded, how many failed, what were the reasons for failure and success. And then later on, when you move on, your knowledge of the projects enhances, then you try to predict as to what kind of projects will succeed and what kind of project will fail. One could hypothesis develop out of this could be that you could say, if the scope is not properly defined, the project will fail. So you see the link and the stage, the initial stage and the in-between stage and the final stage of the knowledge. And based on the level of the knowledge, the purpose of the research is defined. Okay. One more example here is the marketing manager would like to know the sales of a company will increase if he doubles the advertising dollar. Again, straightforward, simple. We're trying to say if the sales are, if the advertising is increased, does the sales increase or not? Here, the manager wants to know the nature of the relationship between advertising and sales. Therefore, a study which its nature is to identify or to predict or to hypothesize or to theorize, then the nature of that study is basically hypothesis testing, where research is just trying to define the characteristics of a certain issue as to how many there are, what is the percentage, how many are male, how many female, so forth. If that is the general kind of information sought out by the research, then the purpose of the research is descriptive. And if the research is being conducted to find out the different, trying to describe this, trying to understand the phenomena which is not clear yet, you're trying to basically define what it is, what that phenomena is, then that kind of research is called an exploratory research. I think we had looked at some of these examples previously and how these statements are formulated. Once we have a hypothesis statement, we can skip on these. So again, to summarize what we've talked about, so an exploratory study are focused on understanding the characteristics of the phenomena of interest, such as a pilot study on a small scale interviewing individuals. This could be done as to define what is an internet club. Defining what an internet club way back in 70s in 80s or 90s would have been something of a phenomena which is something new to the world, but describing as to how many internet clubs are there in the city and how many are open for 24 hours is again a research whose purpose is just to describe. So describe what type of how many internet clubs are there and how many are open 24 hours and so forth. And if we advance this research to the next level, where we could say that into the hypothesis testing purpose, then we're saying the internet clubs have caused a decline in the social values of the country. So here we're trying to make a prediction, or we're trying to theorize that because of the internet clubs, the social moral values of the city or the country has gone down. So here we are trying to theorize or predict or define some kind of a theory. So here the nature of this, the purpose of the purpose of the research is hypothesis testing. Okay, so we looked at the purpose of the study, and within the purpose of the study we talked about three different kinds of purposes, where we said it's exploratory, it is descriptive, or it is hypothesis testing. We move on and we talked about the type of investigation of the study as well. We need to discuss and think about as to what is the type of investigation the study will have, the research will have, and basically there are two types of investigation. One is termed as the causal versus the correlation studies. When the researcher wants to define the cause of one or more problems, then the study is called causal. If you're saying, trying to find out the cause of a problem specifically, categorically, then we say it's a causal study. And when the researcher is interested in outlining the important variables that are associated with the problem or linked with the problem, then we are saying it's a correlation study. Elaborating, this is, let's say, a causal study question could be, does smoking cause cancer? A correlation question could be, are smoking, chewing, tobacco related to cancer? So the difference here is, the difference between these two, between the causal and the correlation questions, is that here your question is, does smoking cause cancer? So you're focused on smoking and cancer here. On the other hand, we're saying, in a correlation study, we're saying smoking, chewing, tobacco are related. We're not saying cause, it is related to cancer. So if a study is considering more than just one variable, and you're trying to consider different variables and its effect on your dependent variable, then that kind of study is considered as a correlational study. On the other hand, if you're just focused at one variable and we're saying this is the cause of the other dependent variable, then this study is considered as a causal study. Usually a causal study will lead, causal question will lead to a causal study hypothesis, which is, we will say smoking causes cancer. So we're making a statement here. We're saying, converting the question into a statement saying smoking causes cancer. This is a hypothesis we might have, and a correlation hypothesis would be smoking and cancer are related, chewing and cancer are related. So we are making, again, statements, but we are saying they are related. So the difference between these two is in the causal study, you're focused on a particular variable, and you're trying to say that this independent variable is the cause of the change in the dependent variable. No other variable other than that has effect. And if that is the scenario, you're just focused at just one variable and trying to say that I want to establish that the cause the cause of change in the dependent variable is because of just one variable, then we will say it's a causal study. Otherwise, if we are saying there are different variables, different factors which might influence your dependent variable, then we are going to state them as the correlational type of study, where basically the investigation is either, as you said, is either causal or correlational. So a causal now will focus on just one variable influencing the dependent variable. A correlation study will consider different factors influencing the dependent variable, and we study these different factors simultaneously to see what is the effect on the dependent variable. So the type of investigation, if that's the scenario, if that is the issue, if you're focused on just one variable, then the type of investigation you're focused on is causal. Whereas in the other case, the type of investigation here, it could be correlation, where there are multiple variables being studied and their influence on the dependent variable is being studied. While conducting these researches, we also need to see and find out if what is the level of researchers' interference in the study. That is, what we mean by that is we want to know the extent of researchers' interference with the normal flow. So we are focused on how much the researcher, while conducting the research, will alter the normal flow of work in a workplace. We basically would like to see that if in the case of a causal study you will, or in the case of correlation studies, the interference level will change. Generally, in a correlation study, the study is conducted in the natural environment of the organization, with the researcher's interference to be very minimum. All he does is basically collect some information, through questionnaires or through observation, and based on that he or she will try to establish the correlation between different variables, but without altering the normal flow of work. So here the normal flow of work is not as much changed as compared to the other scenario where we are trying to say in the causal study. In the causal study, you will need to an extent of research interference a little higher. For an example, in a correlational study, if a researcher wants to study the factors influencing training effectiveness, so again we're saying factors influencing the training effectiveness, this study is a correlational study, because again one thing, there are different factors. Now the second thing we need to know is, if it's a correlation study, we're saying then usually this individual simply has to develop a theoretical framework, collect the relevant data, analyze them, and come up with some findings without altering the normal flow of work. Maybe it's not clear to you at this stage. Let's look at the other example where we have the case of a causal study. In the causal study, as we said, what we tend to do is focus as just one variable and trying to say that the change in the dependent variables is because of that one independent variable. If you remember, we talked about the Hawthorne's experiment way back. In that scenario, we looked at the effects of light on the output of the employees. There, only one variable was being dependent variable. The output was being considered, and one independent variable was being studied. That was the effect of light. And in a causal study, what they did was they basically increased the light and decreased the light. So by making all the other factors constant, what they wanted to make sure was that the relationship between light and output could be established, in that scenario they basically developed a proper experiment whereby they had devised some kind of a lab where they had groups in which in some groups they gave them good light to work with, and then they made another group in which they basically had very little light to work for. Now here the manipulation, if you could see, is much more as compared to whereby you can just go in an office, try to observe how many people basically take tea breaks during the day, or coffee breaks during the day. All they need to do is simply sit in a place and two places and try to observe without modifying the normal flow of work. Whereas in the Hawthorne study, the way I just gave the example I gave you, the lights were reduced, their light was enhanced. There was more manipulation by the researcher, so the interference was way high. So by comparing these two, you could now say that in some studies you basically the interference of the researcher is minimum, whereas in some studies the researcher interference is high. As we were saying, that some of the studies, when the interference is high generally, then we need to also think of in terms of the kind of resources required by the researchers to conduct this research will be different as compared to the amount of resources required by a researcher whose interference is low. Clearly, if in an experiment where you basically try to manipulate more of the variables, more resources and more authorization is required by the researcher, because manipulating certain variables in the workplace is not easy as compared to you cannot just do it on your own. You need proper authorization, and it will affect the workflow of people, so you cannot just do that like that. Especially, let's say, an example of of an organization where the researcher would like to know the effect of pay on the performance of individuals, and if he wants to conduct this research from the point of view of a causal study, he would like to manipulate the pay of different employees, such as he might ask the president of the company to increase the pay of a certain department and decrease the pay of a certain department, and maybe keep the one department's pay as the same. Now, by manipulation of the pay, he could see what is the effect on the performance by among these three departments. Now again, if you could realize, the amount of interference here is much more, and the resources required for this kind of manipulation is much more in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of effort is much more. So if you look at it, these all 3 points which we have discussed here now, where we said that we looked at the purpose of study, the type of investigation, the extent of researcher's interference. In all these three scenarios, if you realize the effort and the amount of resources required are different, and these all choices which you make are interrelated. What I mean by that is, if your research is hypothesis testing, then usually you will be going for the type of investigation would be either correlational or hypothesis testing. And if the type of investigation is causal, then you will have a high level of researchers' interference, whereas in correlation studies it's going to be between moderate level to a low level of interference, meaning that the choices you make in terms of the purpose of study and the type of investigation you are going to take about, or the extent of researchers' interference, will be linked with each other, and one needs to decide upon as what is your purpose of the research and what is the type of investigation you're following. So keeping this thing in mind, we will in the next session we will be again talking more about the different types of research design decisions we need to make, and all these decisions are basically linked with each other. One thing we just want to go back and have before we conclude this session is basically talk about that when we're saying it's a correlational cause and correlational study, usually there are two scenarios among the causal study, whereby you try to, when we're trying to develop a causal study, you might have a scenario where you're trying to develop a pure lab kind of a scenario, a lab experiment kind of scenario, where basically what you do is you develop a special lab for experimenting your research, and in this scenario you have completely an artificial environment, what we call as the contrived environment. And on the other hand, you might also sometimes, the example I gave you of the effect of pay on the output of the employees, in which the CEO or the president of the company was requested to increase the pay of some and decrease the pay of some, and keep some constant. In that case, that's also a type of experiment, but that experiment is considered to be conducted in the actual field, but nevertheless it's an experiment. And on the other hand, if an experiment was conducted within the purview, within the context of a lab, a specially made lab, in which you actually handpicked your people, handpicked and had an artificial environment made especially for this research, then that in that case the causal study is trying to again establish the relationship between two variables, but then you have much more control. You're trying to have more control as to what will be the independent variable, and then the effect of that independent variable on the dependent variable. So as all of these discussions which so far we had basically is trying to see that the effort we will be requiring in the future. So these steps we talked about so far is trying to give us an idea as to how much effort will be required, how much resources will be required. So once we actually embark on and try to implement the research, we have a clear vision, and we have a clear direction, and we have a clear sense of what are we going to do and how much resources we'll be needing, how much time is needed, so forth. So to talk about more about these, we will do that in our second session related to the research design. For now, we close this session and come back with the next session. Allah Hafiz. Assalamu alaikum.